For years, George maintained that there would never be sequels. While he used to flirt a little with the idea of 9 total films, he firmly doubled down during the making of the prequels that 6 would be it. He always maintained, ever since the 80s, that while he had a decent sized story outline for what happened in the prequels, the sequels were never something concrete. He had some ideas, but nothing ever set in stone in his mind like with the prequels. Around 2011, 2012-ish, this changed. George decided to realize some of those ideas into an actual full-fledged sequel trilogy, and work began prior to the Disney acquisition. Lucas remained a part of the project until early 2013 when he voluntarily departed after the rejection of his treatments. The sequels likewise present another problem for EU purists, because what we know about them, which we'll discuss in a minute, does not align with the EU, not even on a broad strokes level. Therefore, to get around this, EU purists will claim one of a few myths. Myth number one: George was just giving ideas. These weren't his actual vision for the trilogy, just ideas for them to make. Myth number two: George wasn't involved in the sequels. Period. Myth number three: the plot of the sequels that most people describe is actually from a game, and George's sequels would have been something else entirely. So let's look at the facts, and then we'll circle back to these. In 2015, George gave his infamous interview with Charlie Rose, the one where he called Disney white slavers. Let's look at some exchanges between the two, with bold font being Charlie Rose and the other font being Lucas. I made a decision to move ahead on the next Star Wars series, and we were starting to do that. So you were starting to make the next Star Wars. Yeah, you as a film or director filmmaker. So we were working with a writer. It wasn't quite working out, but I was also stepping away a little bit too and turning things over to Kathy Kennedy. And so what happened was Disney said, "Gee," or Bob Iger said, "Gee, if you really want to sell your company, if you're thinking about selling it, because we were talking about retirement and what are you going to do after all this?" And he said, "Well, you really want to sell it? We're very interested." So that started that ball rolling, and I knew from I had the story treatments and outlines, and we were just about just working on scripts, and so I sold it. But I knew when I sold it, I said I've tried to make movies where I step away to sort of Empire and Return of the Jedi, right? And after a couple of weeks, I knew I couldn't do that. I had to stand over the shoulder of the director, help him, whisper in his ear constantly, "No, do this, do that," and be there to help guide it. And it was much harder than if I just directed it myself. And Disney, who was a little nervous, there's one of the issues was the first 3 movies had all kinds of issues. They looked at the stories and they said, "We want to make something for the fans." So I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened. It started here and it went there, and it's all about generations, and it's about, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers, and it's a family soap opera. I mean, ultimately, space, we call it space opera, but people don't realize it's actually a soap opera, and it's all about family problems, and that it's not about spaceships. So they decided they didn't want to use those stories. They said that they were going to go do their own thing, and so I decided fine. But basically, I'm not going to try to. They weren't that keen to have me involved anyway. But at the same time, I said I'm not going to. If I get in there, I'm just going to cause trouble because they're not going to do what I want them to do. So, and I don't have the control to do that anymore. And all I would do is muck everything up. So I said, okay, I will go my way. It must hurt you. It's your family. It's the last story. It's your story. There's 3 more stories. And I knew that was probably going to take, to do it right, it would take about 10 years. And I said, I'm 70. I don't know whether I'll be here when I'm 80. Every 10 years, the odds get less. And so I said, I'm not ready to do that because I want to do these other things. So I have to make the decision on my own that it's time for me to move on. As he details here, these are 3 stories he envisioned, and these are stories he intended to be part of making. Not as heavy as the prequels, but he was working with a writer. He owns these as the last 3 stories. Let's move on. In 2012, he had a sit down interview alongside Kathy Kennedy where they talked about his retirement, Kathy taking over, and the future of Star Wars. I have story treatments of 7, 8, 9, and a bunch of other movies, and obviously we have hundreds of books and comics and everything you could possibly imagine. So I sort of move that treasure trove of stories and various things to Kathy, and I have complete confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies. We are absolutely going to make Star Wars movies. This is Kathleen Kennedy who said this. We are absolutely going to make Star Wars movies, and we're in the midst of the really fun part of the process, which is we're sitting down with a couple of writers and we're starting to discuss ideas and we're starting to talk about what those stories might be. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be entirely on my own because it's important that he at least continues to be a little guardian angel on my shoulder helping me. When asked how he sees the role of creative consultant and what it means, George said, I just said I would back her up and I would be there, especially helping with the script and making sure the script, there's a lot of blank spots in the story treatment that we can fill in. And then Kathy said, I think the incredible thing about George is this is not like a series of books like Harry Potter where you've already got a template of what the stories might be. These are original stories and original ideas that come out of a world that essentially is in George's head. So the beauty of the collaboration that can continue is as we work our way through these scripts, if we're sitting and saying to him, I wonder if this character can do that, or does that make sense within the rules of Star Wars, that really he's the keeper of the flame when it comes to that. And then George says, it's the same thing with the first three films. That's all my job is, to be the keeper of the flame. This one is fun to talk about. I see the first quote used so often to try to suggest that George wanted Kathy to turn the EU in the movies, but purists often leave the first part of the quote out, starting with the obviously we have hundreds of books and comics part. The truth is, Lucas wrote story treatments for 7, 8, and 9 for Disney to make, as he says right before that. That's what he wants them to turn into movies, in addition to all the other stuff. He says he's got ideas for other movies, etc. But the key there was he had story treatments for 7, 8, and 9. For the press release upon the Disney buyout, George said in that video, and keep in mind, this came out the day the Disney acquisition happened. George is wearing the same clothes he was wearing when he signed that contract with Bob. The future Star Wars films, Kathy and I have been working on future Star Wars films, and the main reason I brought Kathy on is rather than quit, I wanted to have it move forward, but I needed somebody I trusted who could take that franchise and make it work the way I intended it to. So once Kathy came on board, we started working with writers and started working on all the processes of doing the films. So we've got a plan for 7, 8, 9, which is the end of the trilogy, and other films also. As he said, he, along with Kathy, have already started working on the sequels together. From GQ magazine in 2017, Ford's least expected late career reprise was his return to the world of Star Wars. I was surprised, Harrison concedes. The first call came from George Lucas. It was proposed that I might make another appearance as Han Solo, and I think it was mentioned even in the first call that he would not survive. That's something I'd been arguing for some period of time. Ford had unsuccessfully lobbied for Solo to die in Return of the Jedi in 1983. So I said, okay. From Mark Hamill in 2012. I had no idea that George was going to sell to Disney until I read it online like everybody else. He did tell us last summer about wanting to go on and do episodes 7, 8, and 9, and that Kathleen Kennedy would be doing them. Yeah, last August, he asked Carrie and I to have lunch with him, and we did. I thought he was going to talk about either his retirement or the Star Wars TV series that I've heard about or the 3D releases. So when he said we're going to do episodes 7, 8, and 9, I was gobsmacked. What? Are you nuts? I can see both sides of it. I'm anxious to know what's going on, but the main story was the sale to Disney. I have mixed feelings about that, but they haven't done badly by Marvel and the Muppets and Pixar. It's one of those big decisions that at first seems unusual, but then the more you look at it, the more it makes sense. He was just talking about writers and the fact that he wouldn't be directing. I guess he wanted us to know before everybody else knew. He said, now you can't tell anybody. Even now I'm nervous about saying anything. I just don't know. Also fun to note is the same article mentions a source at Lucasfilm telling them that the EU was being discarded. And this was November 1st, 2012. So, per Harrison and Mark, George was recruiting them and active on episode 7. I doubt Harrison is lying. He doesn't strike me as someone who necessarily cares. And Mark has clearly voiced his disdain for the Disney films and even his initial hesitancy to return. I don't think he's lying either, especially considering the fact that this interview came out 2 days after the Disney acquisition. According to the book, The Art of the Force Awakens, Carter Doug Chang, who worked on the prequels, and David Nakabayashi convened at the Litterman Digital Arts Center in San Francisco on December 11th to handpick a dream team of designers for an episode art department to be inaugurated in January 2013, with plans for a full production design team to be up and running by March. The following day, Carter met Star Wars creator George Lucas for the first time in the main house at Skywalker Ranch. Also, keep in mind, the Art of the Force Awakens book does have some early concept art that is heavily different from the plot of 7 as we know it, that supposedly was approved by George Lucas. It does date to this time frame. Also, from Bob Iger's memoir in 2019 about the Lucasfilm purchase. At some point in the process, George told me he had completed outlines for 3 new movies. He agreed to send us 3 copies of the outlines, one for me, one for Alan Braverman, and one for Alan Horn, who'd just been hired to run our studio. Alan Horn and I read George's outline and we decided we needed to buy them. But we made it clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he'd laid out. He knew that I was going to stand firm on the question of creative control, but it wasn't an easy thing for him to accept, and so he reluctantly agreed to be able to consult with us at our request. I promised that we would be open to his ideas. This was not a hard promise to make. Of course, we would be open to George Lucas's ideas. Like the outlines, we would be under no obligation. Early on, Kathy brought JJ and Michael Arndt up to the Northern California to meet with George and his ranch and talk about their ideas for the film. George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that they weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. The truth was, Kathy, JJ, Allen, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now. But I could have handled it better. I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction. I could have talked through this with him and possibly avoided angering him by not surprising him. Now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed, and while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start. In a 2015 interview with Cineblend, George said, "Well, the ones that I sold to Disney and everything, they came up to the decision that they didn't really want to do those. So they made up their own. It's not the ones that I originally wrote." In 2018, George told Paul Duncan, "I thought I was going to have a little bit more to say about the next three because I'd already started them. They decided they wanted to do something else. Things don't always work the way you want it." So George clearly wrote stories he intended for Kathy to make into the sequels, and he intended to be a part of it, just at a reduced, more overseer type role. In fact, initially, he was a part of it. So what were these stories? These stories that he started working on pre-Disney acquisition. These stories he approached Mark Hamill about before the acquisition. The stories that he has been working with a writer on personally alongside Kathleen Kennedy. They were an adaptation of the EU, right? After all, purists seem to think George turned a treasure trove of stories over to Kathy to make into movies, right? I mean, Star Wars EU was George's true continuation of the Star Wars that he authorized, approved, and contributed to. So, obviously, while there might be minor differences, these stories, they were truly adaptations of the EU, right? What were these outlines? Well, fortunately, we don't have to wonder. George actually revealed his sequel stories in 2018, a little bit to James Cameron, but mostly to Paul Duncan. Let's take a look. To James Cameron, he said, the next three Star Wars films are going to get into a microbiotic world. There's the world of the creatures that operate differently than we do, Lucas said. I call them the Wills, and the Wills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force. To Paul Duncan, he said, then, after the Rebels won, there were no more stormtroopers in my version of the story. I planned for the first trilogy to be about the father, the second trilogy to be about the son, and the third trilogy to be about the daughter and the grandchildren. Episode 7, 8, and 9 would take these ideas from what happened after the Iraq War. Okay, you fought the war, you killed everybody, now what are you going to do? Rebuilding afterwards is harder than starting a rebellion or fighting the war. When you win the war and you disband the opposing army, what do? The stormtroopers would be like Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist fighters that joined ISIS and kept on fighting. The stormtroopers refused to give up when the Republic win. They want to be stormtroopers forever, so they go to a far corner of the galaxy, start their own country and their own rebellion. There's a power vacuum, so gangsters like the Hutts are taking advantage of the situation. And there's chaos. The key person is Darth Maul, who had been resurrected in the Clone Wars cartoons. He brings all the gangs together. Was Darth Maul the main villain? Yeah, but he's very old and we have two versions of him. One is with a set of cybernetic legs like a spider, and then later on he has metal legs and he was a little bit bigger. More of a superhero. We did all this in the animated series. He was in a bunch of episodes. Darth Maul trained a girl, Darth Talon, who was in the comic books, as his apprentice. She was the new Darth Vader, but most of the action was with her. So these were the two main villains of the trilogy. Maul eventually becomes the godfather of crime in the universe because, as the Empire falls, he takes over. The movies are about how Leia, who else is going to be the leader? They're trying to build the Republic. They still have the apparatus of the Republic, but they have to get it under control from the gangsters. That was the main story. It starts out a few years after Return of the Jedi, and we establish pretty quickly that there's this underworld. There are these offshoot stormtroopers who started their own planets, and that Luke is trying to restart the Jedi. He puts the word out, so out of 100,000 Jedi, maybe 50 or 100 are left. Jedi have to grow again from scratch, so Luke has to find 2 and 3-year-olds and train them. It'll be 20 years before you have a new generation of Jedi. By the end of the trilogy, Luke would have rebuilt much of the Jedi, and we would have the renewal of the New Republic, with Leia, Senator Organa, becoming the Supreme Chancellor in charge of everything. So she ended up being the chosen one. I was going to put more about the midi-chlorians and the wills after episode 1, but everybody freaked out and said, "We don't like this, it's terrible," so I didn't. Also, I had an investment in the whole thing financially, so I was forced to relent because I knew it was self-indulgent, but I was very keen to have it be in the movies, and if I'd gone on to do the last 3, it would have all been explained there. There are additional tidbits we learned from early Force Awakens concept art and Pablo Hidalgo tweets, but for the sake of appeasing the critics, I'll keep it at George Lucas's words. Perhaps the first objection I've seen to this from EU purists is, but Maul and Talon idea, that was for a game, and he agreed to keep continuity, so he clearly cared. His sequels were about the microbiotic world. Wrong. First off, the interview with James Cameron was in 2018, and the Star Wars Archives was also in 2018. George never said the sequel trilogy was only about the microbiotic world, or that it was his only idea, only that they were going to dive deeper into it and explore it. But in the Paul Duncan interview in 2018, he talked about the Maul Talon ideas as well as the midi-chlorians. He's been on record saying that the original saga was going to be about the father, the son, and then the grandchildren. It was never going to be completely removed and only about the microbiotic world for 3 movies like he was jumping into Ant-Man or something. Second off, the Maul game is entirely separate, and it just simply seems to be where his idea for Talon came from. The Maul game, known as the Battle of the Sith Lords, was a Star Wars game in development during 2010 by Redfly. Initially, the game was going to be about Maul pre-Phantom Menace and lead up to his death, but it was later expanded to tie into the Clone Wars. As time went on, George then kind of changed the directive of the game. Per Game Informer's Andrew Rayner, who had a discussion with one of the lead creators on the game, Redfly's representatives arrived at the meeting point early the next day, only to find LucasArts employees rushing Force Unleashed artwork out of the conference room and replacing it with other Star Wars artworks, including the placement of sideshow collectible statues of Darth Maul and Darth Talon to the table. The friendly George Lucas entered the room and was eager to hear the pitch from Redfly's creatives. Before they could finish their spiel, Lucas cut them off, stood up, walked over to the statues, rotated them to be facing the same direction, pushed them together, and said, "They're friends," adds the source. He wanted these characters to be friends and to play off of each other. He talked about the show Burn Notice as a reference to the point. He likened Darth Maul to Sunny from The Grandfather, and he likened Darth Talon to Lauren Bacall. He actually did an impersonation of her. It was supposedly the weirdest impersonation of a 40s actress going, "Don't you know how to whistle? Put your lips together and blow." The problem with the problem with the idea of Maul and Talon teaming up for a buddy cop-like experience was that they were separated by over 170 years of Star Wars fiction. As ridiculous of an idea as Frederick Chopin forming a band with Dave Grohl. When this vast time divide was brought up to Lucas's attention, he brushed off the notion of it not working and said that it could instead be a descendant of Darth Maul or a clone of him. The game was later canceled when Redfly received an email on June 24th, 2011 from the LucasArts titled Maul Termination Letter, according to Redfly's Dan Borth. And the source is here on the screen if you really want to investigate. So, the timeline just simply doesn't add up, as George started working on the sequels in either late 2011 or early 2012, which at this point the game had already been canceled. This merely appears to be where George got the idea for pitting Maul and Talon together, something he clearly kept in the back of his mind and went back to when working on the sequels. George's sequels clearly did not align with the EU. EU purists will suggest George Lucas was heavily involved in New Jedi Order, amongst other prominent post-Return of the Jedi EU stories, which we'll get to next. So he should know the basic points of the story. George obviously knew of certain elements, like Mara Jade, and if he really referenced encyclopedias, he should know the basics of the stories. And even if he didn't, he could have set up a brief 2-hour-long conversation with a Lucasfilm official like Howard Rothman or even Leland Chee to get the basics so he could craft the sequel story. But clearly, George ignored it all. Instead of writing a sequel trilogy either centered around the Imperial Remnant, led by Thrawn and Palion, or following the Yuuzhan Vong War with the backdrop of the Solo children becoming Jedi, he removed the Yuuzhan Vong entirely, made the Imperials a footnote if they're even in the story at all after they disappear in the far corner of the galaxy, and then focused on a criminal underworld threat led by Darth Maul, who was resurrected in the continuity of the Clone Wars, so he's tying the Clone Wars into his sequels, and Darth Talon, who would have been about 100 years away from her actual timeline in the comics. Just a fun little note regarding Tower of Talon. People like to say George saw the Republic comics as canon because he brought in Ayla Secura and referenced her being from the comics. Well, he referenced Darth Talon being from the comics, but that would have broken that timeline entirely. And even also too, like Luke Skywalker, he described Luke getting 2 and 3 year olds. It wasn't necessarily recruits or teenagers or adults like it was in the EU. Lucas seems to describing Luke rebuilding the Order in a similar fashion to the Jedi Order of the prequels. So again, this should be the final nail in the coffin for those who think George valued the EU as the true continuation of the saga. I understand that even if he was adapting the EU, there would have been minor discrepancies. But if the EU was the true sequel story, or if he really considered it canon alongside his films, then the sequel trilogy from George should have been an adaptation of the EU storylines with the broad strokes lining up, as opposed to no connective tissue whatsoever. Some may suggest that, yeah, just ignore the sequel trilogy treatments because they never got made. Sure, I get that films change, but not necessarily so substantially. Looking at George's outlines for the prequel trilogy in the 80s compared to what we got shows that while tons of smaller details changed, the broad strokes of the story are still pretty much the same. And even then, it doesn't matter that they didn't get made because, again, he never started with the EU as a blueprint to begin with. He didn't plan on following it, and that should tell us all we need to know. Some may still insist that this is irrelevant and that these weren't George's true vision of the sequels, just various ideas for Disney to pursue that he was trying to pitch to them. And if that's the case, then why did George initially plan on being part of them, working on them, owning them as the last 3 episodes of his overall saga, and only walk away because he felt betrayed and upset that they weren't going to be using those stories? He told Charlie Rose, "There's 3 more stories." If he was really just throwing ideas around for Disney to do, then he's setting up the EU to fail. Why would he do that? If he really valued the EU, should he not be fighting for it? If he was just throwing ideas for Disney to use that were different from the EU, then he was clearly giving Disney the idea to do something separate from the EU and the go ahead to go ahead and move away from that. As I mentioned, some EU purists, in their attempts to bash Disney, will throw the chopped up quote from his sit down interview alongside Kathy Kennedy in 2012, where he says, "Obviously, we have hundreds of books and comics and everything you could possibly imagine. So I sort of moved that treasure trove of stories and various things to Kathy, and I have complete confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies." Obviously, we already looked at how this quote was chopped up and taken out of context, but right before that, again, he mentions having the treatments for 7, 8, 9. But even if we're going to take this quote at face value, like the EU purists want people to do, this chopped up quote, let's say we're just taking that section and interpreting it the way they want us to interpret. That implies he is wanting Kathy to take the EU books and comics and turn them into a sequel trilogy, since that was announced as soon as the company was sold and these videos came out on the same day and later on. But if this is really what this quote means, then again, why would he make treatments that again did not match the EU? Some like to bring up quotes from Lucas where he insists there is no sequel story and suggests that Lucas means he really didn't have anything for episode 7 in mind. In 1997, to Youth TV, when asked about the Luke getting married plot, initially he says not in the prequels because he's not born. When asked so if in the sequel trilogy, Lucas said, I don't know. I'm not sure what kind of characters will be in the sequels, nothing definitive, we'll have to wait and see. Interesting that he doesn't bring up Mara Jade, but even so, Lucas has always had some vague ideas for the sequels, just never a formed story, which is why he insisted he'd probably never do it. He didn't have a story driving him like the prequels. He said in 1993, a new Star Wars movie will hit theaters before the turn of the century. These will be prequels to the current trilogy. For the third trilogy, I don't know if I will still be alive when the time comes to make them. Lucas had various quotes throughout the year stating there is no story past episode 6, and there's the quote he gave on 60 Minutes in 2005, there is no episode 7. First off, he has generally said there is no story there, which, again, is true. He didn't have much more than some scattered ideas and notes. Second off, yes, George doubled down for a few years in the 2000s, but he was also pretty done after Return of the Jedi, and only in the early 90s did he decide, you know what, yeah, I'll actually make the prequels. EU purists might bring up how he said, I always said I'm not going to make more, and that's true, but it doesn't mean I'm unwilling to turn it over to Kathy to make more. But he's also said there is no episode 7. So that right there is contradictory. On top of that, we also showed how originally he did plan to be involved, even when he said those very words. So this quote is again a nothing burger. Third off, EU purists will want to use these quotes to say Lucas didn't see a story past Return of the Jedi to try and ignore his sequel trilogy treatments. But, well, that's also kind of an indictment against the EU as being his story, since those are stories after Return of the Jedi that he's likewise dissing. I haven't seen this particular one used yet, but in case someone brings it up, I want to get ahead of the ball game. At a convention, George was asked, "Why didn't you give Luke a girl?" And he responded, "Well, you haven't seen the last 3 yet." First off, this was not a quote referencing Mara Jade because this happened in 1988, and even then, George kind of laughed at the notion of after stating his response, so it may have simply been a joke. You can find this clip online, it's not just written. And given that we know that he isn't happy about the idea of Luke being married in the future, and even a few years after this, he remained indecisive about the matter to a reporter. So, yeah. Some like to bring up a quote he gave to Stephen Colbert where he says, "The original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren." I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. It's even the novels and everything. Well, first off, it's not saying the novels were the original saga. He's talking about his original 9-part saga as he envisioned and intended it, and he says it's not a secret that that's his original idea, and even the novels got it right. The novels also talk about pre-Skywalker saga stories, but he doesn't bring that up as part of the original saga, so he's clearly talking about the original saga in the context of 9 films. But let's dive further. Here is the remarks leading up to that, and keep in mind, this is April 2015. He already spoke about the treatments being discarded as Cineblend when promoting Strange New Magic in 2015, so it's already something he's publicly talked about, but I'm not sure if Disney had. Stephen Colbert asked him, "What is your hope for the new Star Wars movies? What is your A New Hope for the Star Wars movies as they clearly are heading to a new franchise?" George says, "Well, I hope it's successful. I hope they do a great job. The original saga was about the father and the children and the grandchildren. I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. It's even in the novels and everything, but and the children were in their 20s and everything. It wasn't Phantom Menace again. But they've taken it in a different direction, so I'm hoping and I'm excited to see. If they didn't use my stories, then I have no idea what they're doing." It's clear here he is referring to the story treatments he wrote, which we know the contents of, and not the EU. And as a fun fact, he references here that the grandchildren from the original saga were in their 20s. The new Jedi Order series from the EU takes place between 25 ABY and 29 ABY, ABY meaning after the A New Hope. And in the EU, Han and Leia's kids were born in 9 ABY, meaning they're barely turning 20 by the end of the series, so clearly the EU wasn't what George was referring to. On top of that, Crucible, an EU novel, takes place in 45 ABY and features the last EU appearance of Han Solo in the timeline. If the kids were in their 20s, based off the EU birthday that the latest trilogy could take place, is 38 ABY, and Han Solo was set to die, according to what George Lucas told Harrison Ford when he asked him about returning. So then that also would have retconned the EU. But I'm sure I'm just misunderstanding this quote, and it really is a vain attempt to justify the EU, right? But what about when George said to the licensing, "Do novels, because I'll probably never do novels"? Well, George isn't a jerk. Despite what 2000s era Lucas haters say about him, by all accounts, George is a really nice and down to earth guy. He knew if he let them do the prequels, he would most likely retcon a lot of them when he got around to doing the trilogy, so he let them do sequels instead so that he didn't destroy their life's work right before their eyes. After all, as we saw earlier, Tim Zahn, the author that relaunched the EU, said, "We were allowed to play in George Lucas's driveway. If and when George backs his truck out and runs over our stuff, we have no cause to complain. A lot of my stuff was close enough to the edge." And as we saw, once he got around to actually working on the sequels, a lot of their stuff was in the driveway. So, to go back to our myths, myth number 1, George was just giving ideas. These weren't his actual visions for the sequel trilogy, just ideas for them to make. George was giving the initial ideas of what he wanted the sequels to be. They were his at the time vision for the trilogy. While it's certain some elements would have shifted, the fact that he didn't start with an adaptation of the EU is very telling. And there's no guarantee it would have morphed into that as time went on. Myth number 2, George wasn't involved in the sequels. Initially, he was, and he planned to be. But legally, Disney was not required to follow his stories, and once they decided they wouldn't, he stepped away. His role would have been less than the prequel trilogy, but he still would have been involved story-wise, as he personally said, and left the day-to-day stuff up to the director or producer, just like with Red Tails and Indiana Jones. After all, while he was still very involved, he was less involved in Empire and Return of the Jedi, as opposed to A New Hope or the prequel trilogy, but they are still all his Star Wars stories. Myth number 3. The plot of the sequels that most people describe is actually from a game, and George's sequels would have been something else entirely. Wrong. The game seems to be nothing more than the mere starting place for George's desire to include Talon in the sequel trilogy. George's sequel trilogy treatments were exactly what he personally claimed they were. The sequel trilogy treatments by George Lucas are, alongside the prequel trilogy and TCW, devastating proof to the narrative that George held the EU as canon. Had he would have made film adaptations of the broad strokes of the EU stories that EU purists will claim he was so heavily a part of and approved of. The truth is, George did not see the EU as canon. Had he would have better fit the prequel trilogy to what little was established about the prequel trilogy era. He would have made sure TCW better fit with the Clone Wars multimedia project, and he would have given treatments adapting the EU stories to Disney. Keep in mind, these are films he initially intended to help make and be a part of. The fact that George was not beholden to the EU shows that he didn't view it as part of his personal vision and canon, because if he had, he would have been beholden to it. But now, I'm sure here is where I'll start hearing from the EU purists that George was involved with the EU, etc., and that should be proof alone that he held it as canon. But not so fast. Let's dive in.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them delight.